Yes, okay. I can see everyone from it.
Can you hear me?
All right, we have with us moderator Amit Goel, Vice President and Country Head of India for at Prove, Dembani, Head and Product,
Just turn it a little bit and
Digital Identity at HyperVerge, Debanjan Chatterjee, Head of Decision Sciences, Bureau Inc., Kishore Sharma, Head Partnership, Fonada, and Souparno Bagchi, COO, Balancehero India, True Balance, and Rajesh Sreenivasan, Head of Technology, Media and Telecommunications at Rajah and Tann. We start with the panel discussion on the role of digital identity in a physically distanced world. And over to our moderator, Mr. Amit Goel.
no.
Yeah, can you talk?
Hello,
Yeah.
can you guys hear me?
Yes.
Okay. We'll just let him get mic'd up.
We need to use this? Okay. Fine.
Start.
Yes.
Yeah, it works. All right. Thanks everyone for joining. I would like to start this by saying that we are actually sitting in the land of digital identity innovation, right? We have probably one of the best digital identity systems in the world called Aadhaar. I have also read recently that it has almost complete coverage now in the country, or it's getting there, right? It's pretty insane, right, at the size of this country to be able to achieve that. So, so I think it's a great setting. It's a great place to discuss this. We have in this panel discussion people who are building digital identity solutions, eKYC solutions, onboarding solutions. We have people who are customers of these solutions. We have people who represent the law and the legal side of things. So it's going to be very interesting, that much I can assure you. So maybe, I think digital identity is such a term that a lot of times it is understood in very different contexts. Some people have a very different definition of it. And, it's a very broad term. It can include many, many things. So I think the right place to start for it, especially for people who are uninitiated, is that what is the problem that we have been trying to solve, when it comes to digital identity? And then what is digital identity, right? So maybe Jay, we can start with you since you are building a company in this space.
But Amit, so to understand the digital identity, we need to understand what is identity, right? So, in a physical world, if I have to, justify myself as Jay, then I have got my Aadhaar, I've got my passport, right? So these are the means in the physical world to prove myself that, I am the person who I am saying I am. In the digital world, the points which are considered, right, are slightly extrapolated in that sense, which means that I have multiple data points, right? It can be my phone or email ID. It will be about, my bank accounts, my telephone number, my location, and there are several data points. And when you consolidate the data point of all these data points and map it to an individual, then it becomes a digital identity, right? So a digital identity is sort of a true or a quasi representation of my true self in the online world. So that's basically the digital identity in a nutshell is all about. Now, in terms of when we are talking about what is the problem we are trying to solve, the problem which we are trying to solve here is about the identification and authentication, right? So how do you identify an individual, validate it that this is the same individual with regards to the documents or the data points which has been gathered, and then you authenticate that individual to perform the various set of activities within the ecosystem. So that's basically the problem that has to be solved. And once that an individual is identified and authenticated, you go to a next level and you authorize that individual to perform various activities, as we have rightly said. You make them part of a financially inclusive society, a more formalized ecosystem, and then overall the experience in terms of the digitization improves because you know who you are serving, right? So who are your customers? So that's in a nutshell digital identity, the problem which we are trying to solve, and how we are solving it.
Right. In fact, just to add to that, somebody who has spent like 20 years in digital identity, he told me that internet did not have its own native digital identity. If there was one, we would probably not be having this panel discussion in the first place, right? So if that was not there, what we did was we took all these government-issued IDs and we digitized them, called as DocScan, in the identity world. But then we actually need something more native, more functional, and I think Aadhaar is a great first step towards that. It can scale to 100 million transactions a day. It's available to all sorts of apps to be able to authenticate, authorize, as you were saying. But I think a discussion around this, right, it cannot be just about India and Aadhaar. I think we have Rajesh from Singapore and works at a very big law firm which works in this space. And you have seen, the World Bank ID for ID program. You have also seen the Singapore's program as well. Can you talk a little bit about those and what were the characteristics?
Can do. Thanks. I'm happy to share a little bit on that front as well. First, the ID4D project is all about looking at national identity from a non-governmental standpoint. Identity is a fundamental human right that every human being has, and it should be viewed from that perspective. And the reason why that was an important way of looking at identity is it removes some of the layers of citizenship, for example, or rights of a person to be in the country, separate from your fundamental right of being identified and identifiable. I am who I say I am, and that's a right that was given to me because my father gave me the name that I have. That should not be a national right, it should be a personal right. So when you take that perspective, that's where the Aadhaar model, in a sense, became a very instrumental model that that the World Bank and the UN looked at to try and implement the ID4D project. ID4D stands for Identity for Development, and the project was run in many different jurisdictions. I had the opportunity to look at rollout of that project in various parts of Africa. So I went down to Cote d'Ivoire, Guinea, and Nigeria and helped them to implement identity projects, which are separate from your citizenship, separate from your passports and other forms of indicators. Why is that important? Well, in many countries, for example, nearer to my home in Myanmar, there are individuals who have moved from Bangladesh into Myanmar and they're stateless, right? But being stateless doesn't mean that you have no identity. If an identity system is introduced that's not tied to the state, these people can still be given an identity system without making them nationals of the country. So straight away, separate identity from nationality. Super important from a operational and political standpoint. May I have some time for Singapore as well?
Yeah, please.
Okay, great. So in Singapore's context, it's a very small country, as you know, so quite easy for us to deploy systems and processes. And so what we did was to have a system called SingPass, which is an app-based system. It allows you to basically use it to authenticate your identity across multiple platforms, both governmental as well as private sector. So these days, using SingPass, you can apply for a bank account very easily. It leads to data minimization because you don't need to share the same data set with multiple third parties. It becomes a authentication that's based on easy adoption, APIs that are open to various private sector organizations. And at the end of the day, what this means is you minimize the amount of data that's collected about yourself as an individual. And that's central to Singapore's data protection regime. And maybe later on I'll share a bit about why data protection is important as well in the context of digital identity.
Did you guys lose the... I can't...
Okay.
It's working for you?
Okay.
You can hear me? Okay. Actually, what you spoke about the World Bank's ID4D program, I was on a panel, digital identity panel. There was a lady from Pakistan, and she raised a very important point. She said, there are girls in Pakistan who do not have a birth certificate and a lot of other documents which are required to get a, something like Aadhaar. So what do you do in those cases? So what you said, right? Identity has to be disassociated from government IDs. That's kind of the first step. So very, very,
exactly.
Important point. Souparno, I'll actually bring this to you. Now you're not building an eKYC digital onboarding solution. You are a customer as a lending company, right?
Right.
Lending and payments company.
Right.
Are you satisfied with what you see in the market, what you use, and what is the stuff that you're looking forward to, and the challenges that you face, right? You must be having some set of expectations.
No, absolutely, and thank you for having me here. The way I'll put it is, I'm very happy, but maybe not satisfied. So it's like a typical consumer, right? And as you rightly said, right, we have heard a lot about Aadhaar and how it's helping. Morning also we heard the Honorable Finance Minister speak about like how Aadhaar is kind of actually helping in inclusion, helping in delivering the service. Let me give you some perspective as a consumer. So today, let's say you may refer to our lending business. So in our lending business, like we cover 85% of the PIN codes in India. And just imagine the scale of it. Like we have some 9,100 PIN codes in the country. And we say like 85% of the PIN code, one is like accessibility, reachability. But beyond that, for you to actually deliver and cater to the service, is there something where we can really, really identify? And the larger play, not just like if you see from a digital service standpoint, is like we kind of say it as like, hey, the service is catered even before the instant noodle is ready on your kitchen. So which means like you are doing everything, including authentication, identification of the individual, getting that kind of a trust and confidence that you can actually cater to a service all within less than 5 minutes. And to a country of this size, when you're saying like, hey, 85% plus PIN codes. So it's a testimony of the system, how the system is working, and exactly to the role play, right? Because we are somewhere the strongest consumer, because on one side is the customer who is the beneficiary, on the other side is the providers who are helping us. But we being the bridge, where as a consumer, if you're not able to actually come up and give that kind of a catered solution within the needs, then the entire ecosystem will not get to that level of amplification. So as a consumer, therefore, as you asked, like we are a very, very happy bunch. And at the same time, I qualify that we are not satisfied. The reason being is like, again, going back to the point which you were referring to, see, at the end of the day, identity is not just about authentication, right? So today, if someone is asking like, hey, who are you, Amit, or who are you, Souparno? I just don't refer back to saying that, hey, I was born in the city of Calcutta, so and so year. I don't call out my birth certificate. What I call out is like who I am, what I am doing. So that has become integral part of my identity when we are like in a physical world or a physical interaction. So then that's precisely also the reason I'm not totally satisfied yet, because the way I look at it, this evolution of the ecosystem should be beyond the identity authentication part of it. There are a huge headroom in terms of enriching the data what is there currently. It's not just about your name, it's not just about your, let's say, birth or other details, or it's not just about a unique identifier. It's about like, can you enrich the data without injecting biases into it, so that, let's say, consumer like us, we can actually use the data, we can actually amplify the services beyond what we are currently doing. So that's the way I'll qualify.
I'll let some of them do the sales pitches later on. But let's move to Kishore. You basically were talking about this whole sort of industry and regulatory view of eKYC. And can you talk a little bit about that?
So thanks, Amit. So, see, as we were discussing more in terms of the eKYC, right? So, as most of you guys know, that the KYC is about the identification of yourself, and you do it from a more from a paper form. Now we are talking about eKYC, which is more on an electronical form, in especially doing it through digital. So, from a regulatory perspective, I have seen that the financial services, especially, is on top in terms of the KYC transactions, which is taking place on a digital form. Especially from the last 2 to 3 years, what we have seen, the COVID has helped a lot of people to apply loans and a lot of other activities which is taking place. Whether that is for the short-term loans or the long-term loans, people are opening up themselves to identify electronically. Now, from a regulatory perspective, there is some issues on the cross-border transactions, right? So when you're looking at the cross-border transactions, somebody who is, as Sir has mentioned that, if somebody is coming from Bangladesh to India, cross-border, how do we identify that person, and how do we really, provide those loans and other activities? So, there is the RBI has come up with one of the hackathon. I think the last year in November 2021 November, they have come up with the world's first hackathon, where they have allowed a lot of the developers and the entire ecosystem to come in one place and come up with the solutions which the RBI have identified the problems, right? So one of the problem was how do we change the verification process, especially the OTP base, because we have seen a lot of fraudulent activities taking place with the OTP. So the challenge was given, create an alternative for the OTP, right? So with these kind of support from the regulators and the RBI, I see that the next phase of these fraudulent activities will come down, and the verification process will be more seamless. Thank you. That's what I wanted to say.
Thank you. I think that's a very good segue into another very important topic that we don't talk about as an industry, as a nation, which is fraud, which is happening, right? We are quite obsessed by how the digital transactions are growing and everything. And I, for myself, the company that I work for, we care about fraud a lot. And I know Deb cares about it a lot. So Deb, can you talk about we have talked about what is digital identity, what are the solutions, what are the problems, what are the international frameworks and all that. But can you talk about the second order effects of now we have digital ID solutions, but we are still seeing a lot of fraud, right? So what is happening? How can you curb it? Can you take Kishore's mic?
Sure, thanks. Yeah. Yep. So thanks, Amit, for the question, and thanks, everyone. I think great discussion thus far. So I think something that we are all agreeing on is, the fact that digital identity has sort of grown in importance over the past many years, and especially sort of the pandemic providing an impetus to digitization of everything under the sun. So at this point of time, how the landscape looks like, if you own a business and that has a digital arm, you might be a financial organization, you might be a full-fledged bank, you might be a gaming company, you might even be a matrimonial service provider, right? Verification of people who are using your services is a big deal, and it's an important part of the ecosystem. It's an important part that enables you to provide the right services to right people and also to weed out the bad actors. But what has happened of late is, as is true with every emerging tech, is typically fraudsters are one of the first adapters to any new tech, right? And that the last time we saw that was in the context of e-commerce. So if you're aware, especially in the Western countries, during the late 90s, it was actually syndicated fraud rings that actually embraced e-commerce wholeheartedly, right? And we all know where that has led to. So these days, we are seeing a very similar trend even in our country. So a couple of things that I want to highlight. The first thing is, when it comes to the discourse on fraud in India, we are all aware of UPI fraud, and we are all aware of, the narratives and stories around syndicated fraud rings like Jamtara and so on and so forth. But what we've seen of late is there are a lot of syndicated fraud rings in India that are sort of investing, quote unquote, into the business of, identity theft. So there are a bunch of, modus operandi, as to use a jargon, that sort of goes on in the space of ID theft. One of them is like, simple ID theft, wherein, let's say, I might try to impersonate you and apply for a credit card, and obviously I will not pay back, and hence your bureau score will go for a toss. That's one thing. The other thing is a little bit more advanced, which is known as synthetic ID. And synthetic ID started in the West around 10 years back, but it has started in India, and that's a big concern for everyone. So here what it means is, I, as a fraudster, the person's identity that I'm trying to impersonate, that person actually doesn't exist in flesh and blood. So what I've done is I've stitched together, let's say, the identities of all of you, and I'm trying to apply for a financial product, right? Which makes it all the more difficult for any bank or financial organization to trace, the narrative back to the victim. So these are, some of the main MOs as far as ID theft or ID fraud is concerned. And this is sort of causing a lot of friction. Obviously there's the emotional side of someone being defrauded and losing their life savings, which again doesn't get a talk. Not too many people talk about the emotional impact of fraud, in the mainstream media, right? I think that needs to be spoken a lot more of. The other thing is enabling businesses. So what has happened is, since businesses are trying to weed out the nefarious actors, they are sort of, they've established a one-size-fits-all kind of a framework when it comes to onboarding. So let's say I might not be a nefarious actor, right? But still I've got to go through all those checks that any bank or financial organization has put in place, which to be very honest is a bit disheartening for me, because I think that people are not trusting the digital aspect of me, wherein Debanjan in flesh and blood, speaking at this conference, everyone knows sort of, everyone is in a position to trust me, right? But why it would be the case that as far as my digital twin is concerned, I need to really jump through a lot of hoops to prove that I am the person behind that identity. So I think that's where the landscape is at this point of time. And now speaking on the solutions, sort of how can we sort of combat these kind of frauds? I think a lot of work needs to be put into building proper products, as in counter fraud products, when it comes to synthetic ID, when it comes to digital ID theft. And a lot of sort of awareness needs to be generated on best practices. So, tech and consumer awareness needs to go hand in hand. So people really need to be aware that, it's not okay to share Xerox copies of your Aadhaar and PAN with everyone, which sort of is the culture in India at this point of time. So long story short, I think, it should be a juxtaposition of a lot of cool things that emerging tech is trying to enable, as in better onboarding, more seamless liveliness checks as far as, those onboarding interviews are concerned. Then you have stuff like, let's say, can we use behavioral biometrics? Can we use device intelligence to distinguish fraudsters from genuine people? So there is a lot of research around how a fraudster would use his or her mobile phone, as opposed to how a genuine, how a legitimate user would use. So a lot of those things are being put into use as we speak by the tech community. So I'll give you an example. So let's say in the context of old-fashioned ID theft, let's say, I'm sort of impersonating that I'm one of you and I'm trying to apply for a credit card. Most probably, I will not be spending too much time reading the terms and conditions, or let's say, or the features of that credit card, right? Because I'm applying in bulk as a part of a syndicated fraud ring, right? So then again, some features like the dwell time on that particular section of the app sort of comes in handy when it comes to data analytics or data science or even tech building up solutions. So I think that's where the landscape is heading towards. And I think this is an extremely interesting time to be alive, to be very honest, because you can actually see a full-blown war between syndicated crime and between the vigilantes.
Very interesting. Can you quickly just mention some sort of data or some stats around how much fraud are we kind of seeing? You worked at Paytm before that and at a bank. Can you give us some idea of what is the magnitude of fraud we are seeing in this country?
Yeah, sure. So basically, in my current role, I'm sort of heading decision science at Bureau.id, and all throughout my career, basically, I've seen, especially over the past 5 years, I would say, I've been seeing an exponential growth in all kinds of modus operandi. So basically, if you've been following the the Government of India's annual reports on cybercrime, you would see year on year, almost the fraud rate has doubled, or even the fraud losses that's been attributed to cybercrime, that's almost doubled over the past 3 years. So that's one thing. The other thing is something probably that's more on the positive side. I think traditional media is nowadays, they spend a lot more. They spend a lot more time creating awareness on fraud, which was not the case before. So that's another thing. But coming back to your question, Amit, I think from a stat perspective, you would see, I think the last time a cybercrime report came out, I think 1 in 5 people had some contact with scammers calling them up and sort of, asking for credentials. And that, to be very honest, is an alarming situation.
Yeah, it's probably 4 by 5. I think all
Very
of us
true.
have received SMSs and calls. Actually, in the same breath, I want to talk about, since we're talking about fraud, also about AML. And maybe Kishore, if you can talk about, in terms of industry and regulatory view, what's happening with AML?
Well, as they just mentioned about the kind of transactions are taking place, the volumes have increased. Obviously, when you have a lot of volumes which is taking place, it's very difficult to maintain that clean hygiene of transactions. And you will definitely find these kind of fraudulent activities taking more because there is a lot of chances are being given, right? So I'll take one of the use case of a diamond in jewelry, which I have witnessed. So all over the world, when you are basically doing in transactions, right? So in this particular industry, you may do a KYC, but at the same time, it's very difficult to do a KYB, know your business. So when you do, as a business owner, you need to know who's your supplier, you need to know who's your retailer, you need to know who's your end customer. So all these aspects, right, comes into the AML, and very difficult for a business to maintain this data and hand over this to the regulated body whenever they seek information. So these particular problems which I have specifically seen in this one industry, the diamond and jewelry. And this is one of the industry which has highest fraudulent activities from a volume, not from a volume perspective, but from a value perspective. So how far, the FATF is trying to take care of this is to the banks. So what they do is they allow the banks to take the certificate from the AML officers, and those certificates has to be audited by the banks, and then the certification is provided. So this is one of the prospects, the aspects that I have seen in terms of the AML. And rightly mentioned by my colleague, the fraudulent activities are blowing right now. So one of the thing that we have witnessed with one of my a colleague, he was going in a metro, and we see that we have this particular wireless transactions. You can make the payment, right? So through the RFID. So you got to be very careful when you are having this activated, especially when you're keeping in your back of your pocket. So somebody would easily scan it, and the payment is through. So the fraudulent activities is not only on the digital form, but it can happen when you're walking on the street as well. So we got to look at how these kind of transactions or how these particular activities can be reduced. I also heard from one of our colleague here that we have the blocker, right? So if you want to, somebody is trying to do the transaction like fraudulently, so you have a blocker where you can use the solution. So happy to see that the problems are there, and at the same time there are some solutions are being brought up in the industry, and I hope that some of the data aspects which they mentioned, from that perspective we can bring it down.
Right.
Thank you.
So let's. I think we went very deep into the solutions and fraud. Let's zoom out a little bit. I would not talk about India's privacy law here, but I think, Rajesh, I would like to ask you that there is a very important overlap between data protection laws and digital identity, right? I think that's a conversation we must be having here.
Absolutely.
So if you can touch upon that.
Yeah, absolutely. I think India was very pragmatic, just speaking as an outsider looking into India, in terms of going ahead with the Aadhaar project without a data protection law in place. In fact, it's very counterintuitive. Most times you will have the law in place first, and then you have a digital identity program to follow. Because without the law, you don't have the structure for giving people the ability to protect their personal data and to take action against people who misuse their personal data. Having said that, and looking at the numbers as they stand, you have almost 100% penetration in terms of Aadhaar across the country. You can't but admire the guts of the guys who did it, the way that they have. And for the people of India, in a sense, to accept it, because from my experience, there's always a very strong culture here of having adequate stakeholders coming in and arguing for protection of individuals' rights. And yet, that division was given enough power to go ahead and get this done. Having done it, it is now even more urgent for India to get the law in place. Very urgent that India needs to put the data protection law in place. Again, outside looking in, I've been following the saga in terms of getting India's data protection laws passed. It has to happen soon, because right now data is being collected about every person through the Aadhaar system. And there has to be clear rules with regard to what the data can be used for. I think there's two concerns. One, of course, is public sector. What's the government using the data for? But more importantly, if Aadhaar is to work, and it has as an identity system for the country, third parties who have APIs built in, the UPI system for payment purposes, for example, those systems need to also be properly controlled in terms of the data that's being collected. The panel that just came before ours was talking about monetization of the data. That, as a lawyer, all the alarm bells goes off. Right? What do you mean by monetization? Whose data? Do I have a right to say whether or not my data is going to be used for these purposes? The law has to be passed sooner rather than later. To share some experiences from jurisdictions where these laws are in place, what happens is, if that data is misused, I have a right to take action against the organization. I have a right to withdraw consent. So my data can't be used until I've given consent for the data to be used. That consent is withdrawable. I can go to the organization and say, stop using my data. Or stop using my data, let's say, for marketing purposes, but please carry on using it for transactional purposes. Those kinds of rights are fundamental rights, again, that need to be put in place. So that's how it's done in jurisdictions where there are data protection laws. You can go to make a complaint to a commissioner. In Singapore's case, for example, we have the Personal Data Protection Commission. It's a very transparent regulator. If you Google PDPC Singapore, you see a whole list of cases showing how the regulator protects the individual's right to their personal data. Any company that misuses data, and I don't mean cyber attacks, I mean using the data beyond the purpose for which a person had given their right, that company can be taken to task, action can be taken, fines will be imposed for misuse of the personal data. So that's essentially how the personal data regime works.
Yeah. I think it's a very big topic around consent and how you protect the data. But in the interest of time, I'll do a quick switch again. Souparno, it will be fair to say I've spent some time in this sector, so I would say that a lot of progress has been made on the consumer, people side of digital identity, right? But what about companies, enterprises, SMBs, goods and services?
Right.
Can you talk about that?
No, absolutely, Amit. If you see broadly, right, there are three major cohorts when it comes to data or digital identity, if I may say. One is like the people, the end consumer. Another is like the systems and how you identify digitally that this is the right system coming in, kind of a thing. And the other cohort is like in terms of the entities, like the businesses. Kishore, you touched upon the business side of things, right? So today, if I look at it, we have put largely the onus on the end consumer. So if I'm the end consumer and if I have to kind of be a beneficiary of a service, be it from the government standpoint or be it from the business standpoint, I need to prove my identity. And then the other players are kind of in the process of validations, etc. But just turn the table for a moment. So there is also an equal onus and it's also a benefit for the businesses if they themselves can be identifiable in a very, very seamless and frictionless manner. Today, as we do business, there are troubles of counterfeit. And I'm not just talking about like a physical goods or let's say you're buying a pair of shoes, whether it's a counterfeit product or not. I'm talking about like even in the digital space. You're looking at an app, the app says ABC. How do you know this app is actually ABC or someone is trying to kind of misuse your logo? And that's where that aspect of digitally identifying, verifying the enterprise would be in a way a game changer. I think the way we have progressed a lot on the consumer side of it, identifying the enterprises digitally, and actually it's going to be in favor of the consumer and the customer empowerment. So me as a consumer, if I'm interacting with an app, me as a consumer, if I'm interacting with a business, be it in the setting of a B2C or even in a B2B, if I can digitally authenticate, like the way we are doing for the consumer, we can digitally authenticate the business, be it in terms of third-party onboarding or be it in terms of like when I'm actually taking a service from the business, within 5 minutes, 10 minutes, half an hour, totally digital, that would be a game changer. So if you look at it from, let's say even pick up any data research, it ranges, it says like, hey, if you have digital identity on the consumer side, your impact to the GDP could be anywhere between 3 to 6% kind of a figure. Now just imagine if you can get the enterprise into the ecosystem, that's like even going to kind of in a way catapult to a different degree in terms of the GDP influence, making it totally frictionless in supply chain finance, making it really, really empowering for the consumer to identify that they are interacting with the right enterprise. So I think that aspect is, as a customer to the entire ecosystem, I think that aspect is something we are really looking forward to.
And no, you're right, there are a lot of second order effects of that because we have created a lot of tech islands because enterprises don't have like a one particular standard around this.
That's right.
But can you double tap on that one thing that you mentioned, that how do we know as a consumer if this is the company, this is the app that we are in? Are you seeing any fraud around that?
Yeah, so there is, if you look at it, like one thing which used to happen in the physical world, and you would have, all of us would have heard about, like, whether the pair of shoes which you're buying, is it actually the brand which you want to buy? But now if you see the digital world, the app which you're interacting with, is it the actual app or is it like really authorized by the actual app to kind of use your logo, etc.? So we do see situations where it's like a daily fight, and then there are situations in terms of like people coming up, the app pops up one fine day, and then you kind of work with the authorities to get it down, and then the other day again it will pop up. It's almost like a guerrilla warfare. So it's a constant battle which we are facing, and that's the reason it's so important that in terms of digital identification, this entire enterprise ecosystem do come into play. In some cases, Amit, like it's working wonderfully, not just from the fraud standpoint, but also in terms of catering the services standpoint. All of you would have, I'm sure, like about Udyam Aadhaar, right? So in some ways, if you see not just about the fraud aspect, it's also about how you kind of cater to it, and again in the morning you heard Honorable Finance Minister speaking about priority sector, right? Now, things like Udyam Aadhaar is really, really good, and I'm sure like it's going to go leaps and bounds, but again, that has to come for the entire ecosystem of enterprises.
Know your business is a very important
Know your
topic.
business, yes.
But like in the fintech world, retail, consumer, fintech has overshadowed B2B. I feel it's the same thing here as well.
Yeah.
But Jay, you have the last word on this. Okay. Can you talk about any other challenges that we have not discussed today, and especially also about opportunities that are there in digital identity as a whole?
I think from a challenges perspective, we have touched upon almost everything that is out there. But I'll be more optimistic and I'll talk about the opportunities. Talking about what Souparno has highlighted, that KYB is another emerging area where Udyam is just one data point, but if you look at the universe of the checks which government is currently offering, there are close to 40 to 50 checks which you can do on a business to identify whether that business is valid or not. So that's one of the opportunities where these we are working on such kind of systems where we ensure that the entity with whom we are doing business is to a great extent verified. So that's one of the areas which I believe is a tremendous amount of opportunity. And just to double click on what Souparno was talking about in terms of the identity, right? So when we talk about identity, we are not just talking about identity, just one aspect of it, but we are talking about identity as a plus, right? So there is an element of transaction analysis. There is that includes KYB, that includes AML. So we are talking about identity where the ecosystem itself is identified, right? So when you have each and every stakeholder in the system, if there are guardrails in place, and which currently there are some, and more needs to be built, right? So listing of such apps in the Google, App Store, right, where the government of India has recommended that, all the apps should be whitelisted, right? It's a step in that direction. Once we are nipping the problem in the bud, and then we are ensuring that every stakeholder of the system is identified and authenticated with the systems we have got available in place, I think that's a big opportunity which I'm seeing at the moment.
Just one last question, and I know we have 30 seconds left. Also, I think it will help me professionally to learn from you that, so we have solutions, right, to a lot of problems that we discussed today, but the buyers have to buy as well, right? So what do you imagine, like, we have to change, as an industry, or, the way of selling or the way of adoption? Will it be like how NPCI is saying, like for ODR in, UPI, online dispute resolution, there's a deadline. So is that the only way, or have you experienced something else which makes buyers buy fraud solutions and e-KYC solutions?
So, first is regulator push is required, right? So that goes without saying. But, given that if there is a regulator push, there are plenty of opportunities. As I said, in Southeast Asia, like, we have done, validation over there where, we have created a sort of a consortium, right, where we can identify the, fraudulent actors, right, as soon as they enter into our database, right? So that sort of a dedupe check we have kind of inbuilt in our technology, right, and it's validated, right? So now, the way we are positioning, and, we want the industry to position itself is that, there is a benefit to the business, right? So there is a cost of compliance. If I am not following the compliance, if I'm not verifying the businesses, then I have a cost to pay, right? Which we are seeing that, the accounts are being frozen of a big, players. And if they're not following the compliance, right, you're losing customer, right? So the time to onboard a customer is increasing. The customer experience itself, the trust in the business is getting lost. So as an ecosystem, the entire industry is losing. I think that sort of a pitch is necessary, for the compliance. So a push from regulator, and the cost of the compliance is a very important factor, to make buyers realize that, this is something that needs to be addressed on priority with technology solutions.
I could barely hear you towards the end because of this issue, but I think we are up on time. Thank you so much, guys. This was a very interesting discussion. And a digital identity discussion is never complete, right? So we'll probably carry it offline as well. Thank you so much.
Thanks a lot, Amit.